The beast of Revelation 13, therefore, is man in the fullness of his powers, without God. It is man exerting himself to the fullest extent of his considerable powers to establish the grand world kingdom, featuring man without God. 666 comes short of 7. 7 is the number of man with God in the fellowship of the covenant. 7 is the number of Jesus Christ, the incarnate Son of God. These biblical prophecies of the full final development of the worldview of man and of the kingdom of man, the worldview is a worldview that envisions, seeks, plots, and realizes the ambitions of Satan from the beginning. And those biblical prophecies of the full realization of the worldview of man are now being fulfilled, especially in the nations of the West. This worldview of man, now dominating the entire societal and cultural landscape, manifests the essence of sinful human nature from the beginning. That is, from the historical fall of the real Adam and Eve in paradise. To this temptation, they and we in them yielded. Ye shall be as God. That's the literal translation of the Hebrew. And the account of the temptation. Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. That on that occasion, some 6,000 years ago, our first father, and we in him, responded in a very godlike manner. We said, as God, we decide that eating the forbidden fruit is good for us and right, regardless what God has said. Today, in a similar godlike manner, a majority of black-robed Supreme Court justices in the United States of America that used to call itself a Christian nation, representing the nation and expressing the wisdom of the great universities, the divinity of prominent churches and theologians, thinking of the most powerful politicians and the will of the people, these justices have said in a godlike manner, as God, we judges decide that the murder of millions of unborn humans is good for us and right, regardless what God says. I notice in passing that the worldview of man is murderous, cruelly murderous. Without a qualm, it sanctions the unspeakable horrors of abortion, particularly late-term abortions. Let us not forget that it was the worldview of man that performed the bloody work of Hitler's Nazi Third Reich, of Lenin and Stalin's communistic state, and of Mao's regime. The worldview of man will shortly show itself murderous against the true church and her members. Before I mention and briefly describe some of the main features of the biblical Christian worldview, I want to take note in passing of a theory of worldview that claims to be the right Christian worldview and that sharply differs from the Reformed worldview that I have sketched earlier. I am referring to the worldview of common grace. The worldview of common grace is a view of creation and history that sees the church and the ungodly world, that is, believers and unbelievers, cooperating to bring about a good, godly, and even Christian society and culture before the end. It has a vision of what it calls a Christianized society. A society that outwardly is Christian, and even of a Christianized world. This world view controls the life of those who share it, as all world views do, so that the chief calling of Christians, according to them, is to cooperate with unbelievers in improving society and making the nation and then the world Christian outwardly. According to the worldview of common grace, the Christianizing of culture is God's purpose with history and creation. One of two purposes He has, they say, the other being the salvation of the church. To achieve this purpose of common grace, God is supposed to give grace to the ungodly, just as He gives grace to the godly, hence the name common grace. This is a theory of worldview that was propounded by the Dutch theologian Abraham Kuyper. This is the view of the world that was adopted by the Christian Reformed Church in 1924. This is the worldview that is approved by many evangelicals, probably most evangelicals in the world today. I must mention it because it is beyond doubt a prevailing theory of worldview among many Reformed and evangelical thinkers. But I do not need to devote much time tonight to criticizing that worldview as thoroughly unbiblical, as without any basis in the Reformed confessions, and as detrimental and destructive to and of the spiritual separation and warfare between the church and the world, believer and unbeliever, city of God and city of man. I do not have to take much time in criticizing this worldview because today this worldview is being exposed by God in the events of history. This worldview has been a colossal failure. It has been around now for over 100 years, and it has not Christianized any place. It hasn't Christianized the Netherlands. It hasn't Christianized the United States. It hasn't Christianized Grand Rapids, Michigan. On the contrary, it has ruined Abraham Kuyper's Free University and the churches that Abraham Kuyper established, once sound churches. It's in the process of destroying the Christian Reformed Church, which is now entertaining the real possibility of sanctioning the committed homosexual relations of sodomites and lesbians. Today, evangelicals are appealing to this worldview to support their union with Rome in fighting the culture wars. That's the movement known as evangelicals and Catholics together. But the main reason for ignoring it, as I'm going to do shortly, is that it is now a pathetic irrelevancy. A pathetic irrelevancy. The juggernaut worldview of man is rolling over the common grace worldview as the incoming tide rolls over a sandcastle on the beach. One worldview, and one worldview only, can stand against the worldview of man. The worldview of the sovereign God of Scripture is revealed in Jesus Christ and as realizing itself in the life of true Christians by irresistible, invincible, particular grace, the grace of the Spirit of Jesus Christ through the gospel. One kingdom withstands the kingdom of the beast, the kingdom of Jesus Christ.